April 1945. A liberated labor camp near Nordhausen. Germany's spring daylight cuts through the gray sky, hitting the mud, the rusted wire, and the heavy wooden doors of the long, dark barracks. Everything seems quiet after the tanks roll through, until an American soldier pries open a heavy wooden door to a separated rear enclosure. Inside, a tiny, high-pitched scream pierces the air. A 3-year-old child covers her eyes, weeping in absolute terror as the natural light hits her face. 14 small children huddle in the dirt, recoiling from the sun as if it were a physical weapon. They have never stood on grass, they have never seen the sky, and they have never known a world outside these rotting wooden walls. The general will soon find out that the men who built this cage left a crime so precise. It requires a punishment that forces the perpetrators to live in the exact dark they created. This is the story of what Patton did when soldiers found children who had never seen sunlight. It is a chronicle of what soldiers found that changed them forever, revealing the heavy cost of a system designed to erase human identity. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what soldiers found that changed them forever, uncovering the forgotten truths from the front lines. Private First Class Angela Rossi was 20 years old, hailed from Brooklyn, New York, and served as a Women's Army Corps member attached to the Forward Liberation Unit. Before the war, she had worked in a neighborhood bakery, helping her family survive the Depression while watching her 2 older brothers march off to the Pacific Theater. Her own journey across Europe had already exposed her to the wreckage of broken cities, but nothing in her training or background prepared her for the direct, intimate cruelty of the camps. She had lost her oldest brother at Guadalcanal, a deep personal grief that drove her to enlist so she could do her part in rebuilding a broken world. On that sharp spring morning, she was the person who stepped through the wire to investigate the quiet barracks, completely unaware that her presence would break the silence of a hidden prison. The man responsible for that hidden prison was SS Hauptsturmführer Emil Roth, a 40-year-old camp commandant from Dusseldorf, Germany, who viewed the entire facility as a strict exercise in administrative efficiency. Roth was a dedicated bureaucrat who believed entirely in the total erasure of undesirables, often repeating his core conviction that camp property belonged exclusively to the state and required no human consideration. He operated from a warm, immaculate stone office, wore a perfectly tailored gray uniform, and took immense pride in his highly polished leather boots and the pristine iron cross pinned to his chest. While prisoners withered away under his command, Roth enjoyed fresh cream, private quarters, and an abundant supply of imported coffee. His ledger books were kept with absolute neatness, every single child born within the compound reduced to a sequential number tattooed onto small forearms, effectively removing their names from the human record. By the spring of 1945, the entire European theater was collapsing into absolute chaos. As the Allied armies pushed deep into the German heartland, the German war machine was broken. Its supply lines were shattered, and the central government had effectively ceased to function. In this atmosphere of total defeat, many concentration and labor camps were abandoned by their regular guards, leaving behind thousands of starving prisoners trapped inside rotting wooden compounds. The rapid advance of the American Third Army meant that frontline combat units frequently stumbled upon these facilities entirely by accident, forcing soldiers to suddenly transition from combat operations to emergency humanitarian relief. Most frontline officers simply lacked the resources or medical personnel to handle these massive encampments, often choosing to secure the perimeters, provide temporary rations, and wait for specialized rearguard detachments to take over. Many commanders let administrative protocols slide, focusing exclusively on basic military logistics while ignoring the complex human crises unfolding within the inner barracks. This widespread operational neglect allowed camp administrators to maintain a lingering hold over their domains, enforcing their cruel internal rules even as American tanks patrolled the main roads. In some liberated sectors, the local populations pretended to know nothing about the massive suffering occurring just beyond their town limits. claiming total ignorance to avoid responsibility. The sheer volume of the disaster overwhelmed the standard military apparatus, leaving low-ranking soldiers to discover the deepest horrors entirely on their own. But as the morning sun climbed higher over the compound near Nordhausen, the casual avoidance of the local authorities came to an abrupt end when the reality inside the separated barracks could no longer be ignored. Captain Thomas Miller, a 31-year-old medical officer from Columbus, Ohio, walked into the main administrative office with a thick folder of camp manifests clutched tightly in his hand. He looked directly at the former camp commandant, who sat calmly behind his large mahogany desk, smoothing the fabric of his clean gray uniform. Miller pulled out a wooden chair, sat down heavily, and placed the document directly between them, tapping his finger on the top page. "We have just completed the initial sweep of the Northern Sector barracks," Captain Miller said, "and we found the 14th child hidden behind the wired partition." SS Hauptsturmführer Emil Roth looked up slowly from his paperwork, adjusted his silver spectacles, and let out a short, dismissive breath. "The administrative records of this facility are fully complete," Roth answered, "and every piece of registered property has been properly logged. There are 14 children under the age of 4 living in total darkness," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave as he leaned across the desk. "They are starving, they have sequential numbers tattooed on their arms, and they cannot look at the daylight without screaming in pain." "You are looking at this situation through an emotional lens," Roth said, crossing his arms and leaning back comfortably in his leather chair. "Those individuals do not possess names or birth certificates because they are officially classified as camp property under state regulation. They are human babies," Captain Miller replied, slamming his open palm down onto the mahogany desk. "I am ordering you to turn over the medical supplies, the milk rations, and the real identification registries for these families immediately. The regulations do not provide civilian food or specialized medical treatment for unregistered elements," Roth said, his eyes narrowing as he gestured toward the pristine iron cross on his chest. "Our legal system explicitly dictated that children born within these walls belong entirely to the state apparatus, to be maintained at the minimum operational cost until their final disposition. You kept them in a cage like animals," Miller said, standing up from his chair. "A cage keeps things orderly," Roth answered, a cold smile touching the corner of his mouth. "A modern state cannot be burdened by the weak, and those numbers are the only identity they require." Captain Miller realized at once that no argument or military regulation would ever pierce the man's absolute bureaucratic arrogance. He closed the folder, picked it up, and turned toward the door without another word. Knowing this matter had already escalated far past his own medical authority, he walked quickly to the radio room and ordered the operator to contact headquarters immediately. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly to the administrative building, kicking up a thick cloud of yellow dust against the wire fences. 4 polished brass stars gleamed on his green helmet, and the distinct ivory grips of his revolvers rested against his hips. The entire room fell into an immediate, breathless silence the moment his boots struck the floorboards. He walked in unannounced, completely bypassing the guards, his eyes fixed onto the German officer who remained seated at the mahogany desk. Patton did not raise his voice, but the cold weight of his presence filled the small room instantly. "You are the officer responsible for the administration of this sector," Patton said. SS Hauptsturmführer Emil Roth stood up slowly, adjusted his tailored gray jacket, and gave a brief, rigid nod. "I am the chief administrator of this facility, General," Roth said. "You ordered the children born within this compound to be separated behind wire fences," Patton said. "I merely enforced the standing legal protocols of the state apparatus," Roth answered, touching the edge of his pristine iron cross. "You tattooed sequential numbers onto the forearms of babies," Patton said, his voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper. "Unregistered elements do not receive names or official birth records under our system," Roth replied, leaning slightly forward. "It is standard administrative procedure for property." Patton studied him for a long, terrible moment, his hands resting loose and steady near his belt. When he spoke again, his tone was entirely devoid of anger, carrying only the absolute finality of an executioner. You spent years running a system that turned children into inventory numbers because your worldview told you that compassion was a form of military weakness. You sat behind a clean desk in an immaculate uniform, eating fresh cream and drinking imported coffee while 3 infants starved to death in a dark wooden box right outside your window. You looked at human babies and saw state property that didn't deserve to feel the heat of the sun or see the color of the open sky. But your system is completely dead now, and the small numbers you inked into their flesh will be recorded as the exact evidence that hangs you. Private Rossi from Brooklyn enlists to rebuild a broken world after losing her brother, and she understands more about true strength than your entire general staff ever conceived. She sat in the mud and showed those children the very first act of human gentleness they have ever known, breaking the terror you spent 4 years carefully manufacturing. Now you are going to face the exact reality you created for them, without your desk, without your regulations, and without your tailored comforts. You have a choice. You can personally lead my medical teams into that barracks, carry those children out into the sunlight yourself, and hand them over to our doctors. Or I will have my infantrymen lock you in that exact wired cage until the War Crimes Commission arrives to build your gallows. Decide now. Roth looked into the general's unblinking eyes, his face draining of all its remaining color as his hand drifted away from his medals. He gave a single, halting nod of compliance, his tight bureaucratic composure shattering completely under the quiet weight of the command. The heavy wooden door swung open completely, and the 14 children were brought forth from the dark enclosure under the direct supervision of the American Guard detail. Private Rossi stepped forward first, reaching down to gently lift a 2-year-old child who clung frantically to her neck, burying her small face away from the intense glare of the midday sky. SS Hauptsturmführer Emil Roth walked rigidly behind them, his polished leather boots sinking into the thick mud as he was forced to carry a weeping 3-year-old girl directly into the open courtyard. The sharp spring daylight hit the children all at once, causing several to scream in absolute terror and cover their eyes from a sensation they had never experienced in their short lives. A 3-year-old took her very first trembling steps onto the green grass, then immediately burst into tears because the unfamiliar texture beneath her bare feet frightened her. Dozens of liberated camp prisoners stood along the rusted wire fences, watching in absolute silence as the former commandant was made to personally undo the isolation he had spent years enforcing. Patton stood by his jeep, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes tracking every movement as the children were carefully transferred into the awaiting field ambulances. The heavy scent of damp earth and exhaust fumes filled the air as the vehicles cleared the gates, leaving the pristine uniform of the administrator stained with the very mud of the compound he had ruled. Private First Class Angela Rossi returned to Brooklyn, New York, after the war, carrying the memory of that liberated compound with her for the rest of her days. She married a local carpenter in 1948, raised 4 children of her own, and spent her life working in community centers, helping immigrant families adjust to their new lives. She never spoke about the children's barracks to her neighbors, but her family kept a small, blunt pair of Army-issued scissors in a velvet box on the mantel, the very tool she used to cut the camp rags away from the infants. She lived a quiet, purposeful life, always seeking the sunlight, until her peaceful passing in the winter of 1996. SS Hauptsturmführer Emil Roth stood before a military tribunal at Nuremberg. Later that same year, his immaculate administrative records serving as the primary evidence for his conviction. He was stripped of his rank and his medals, serving a full 20-year prison sentence before being released into absolute obscurity in Western Germany. He lived out his remaining years in a small, windowless basement apartment in Dusseldorf, bitter, abandoned by his former associates, and completely forgotten by the state apparatus he had served. He died alone in the dark during the autumn of 1971. General Patton himself made a singular entry in his personal diary on the evening of the camp liberation, describing the 14 children as a crime against nature itself. He kept a duplicate copy of the Red Cross registration forms in the bottom drawer of his field desk until the day he died. He once wrote to his wife that a nation which wars against its own infants has already signed its own death warrant in the eyes of the Almighty. Some historians have argued that Patton's direct intervention at the camp was primarily a theatrical display, designed to create a powerful public impression for the war crimes investigators, rather than a sustainable military solution. They suggest that forcing the German administrator to physically move the infants did little to change the broader logistics of Allied medical relief, which already faced massive shortages across the entire occupation zone. Other historians argue the exact opposite, maintaining that such highly visible, mirrored confrontations were essential for breaking the stubborn bureaucratic denial of the remaining German officials. What is certain is that the registration records ordered by Patton ensured these 14 children received their permanent human identity, preventing them from being erased from history. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply forwarded the report to the rearguard authorities and left the camp immediately? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what soldiers found that changed them forever, make sure to subscribe.